persisting infrastructural deficits in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there has been a call for the need for fiscal consolidation if it hopes to improve its economic indices. We've been talking to Dr. Josh Bamfo, partner and head transfer pricing services, Andersen in Nigeria. Dr. Bamfo, before we went on that particular break, you highlighted a couple of challenges facing Sub-Saharan Africa. You were about to talk about the measures, or should I say the solutions, but then let's still put these three pivotal countries in context. Now, according to the African Development Bank Group, Ghana's fiscal deficit is projected to be 4.2% of GDP in 2025, and this is a slight narrowing from the 4.9% projected for 2024, as we saw. For Nigeria, over the past decade, the deficit grew 11 times, rising to 1.1 trillion naira in 2015, from 1.1 trillion naira in 2015 to about 13.8 trillion naira, even as it's been projected for 2025. Now, for South Africa, the National Treasury projected 5.0% deficit in 2025, up from 4.5% that was previously forecast. So how are we going to drive infrastructural investments when we see these widening gaps in the budgets? For the measures that you're going to be sharing with us, would they even be enough to actually plug this gap?
So that is actually the challenge, because fiscal consolidation tends to be contractionary in nature. So what you want to do is that you're either going to increase tax revenues because you want to bridge the gap, or you're going to decrease expenditures, typically expenditures on capital projects that are necessary for economic growth, or a combination of the two. So in the short term, short to medium term, fiscal consolidation can actually have an adverse impact on the economy in terms of growth and creating job opportunities. However, depending on where the economy is at in terms of its debt situation, fiscal consolidation might be a necessary approach to go. So if we take Ghana's case, for example, which is the poster boy when it comes to the need for fiscal consolidation, the reason why Ghana went through its current macroeconomic crisis was because prior to COVID-19 2020, their debt to GDP ratio was already over 60%, which was much closer to the prohibitive 70%. Now, during COVID and post-COVID, it went as high as almost 92% in 2022. So what that meant was that they couldn't access the capital markets because the independent credit rating agencies such as Fitch, such as Moody's, downgraded their sovereign bond rating. What that meant was that they couldn't actually defend the exchange rate that they were trying to manage, and had adverse impact in terms of importation such as fuel products, and therefore led to high inflation, and that led to the instability of the economy. So what that tells you is that when your debt situation is pretty bad and could be distressed, fiscal consolidation becomes an absolute necessity, or else there will be worse implications down the line. If you take Nigeria's case, it's slightly different. Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio is below 50%. As of 2023, I think it was around 44%. However, their debt financing is so significant that sometimes it can be close to almost 100% of your tax revenue that you've collected for that year. That poses a problem. That means that over time, you could have a debt distress challenge, but that is not as immediate compared to that of Ghana. So once again, even though Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio is more bearable, it still has to implement measures to ensure that they consolidate fiscally. And that's the reason why, if you look at Nigeria's case, the current government actually had a fiscal reform committee led by Taiwo Oyedele to ensure that we have a tax revenue collection policy that is more broad-based and that can generate the necessary revenue to take care of the expenditures that they need in order to put the economy in good stead when it comes to growth. But then, Nigeria has infrastructure deficit gap, which they need to finance.
Okay, so Dr. Bamfo, you're talking about increasing tax revenue. Even the latest tax reform bills pushed by the Tinubu administration is generating a lot of heat right now in Nigeria and in the legislative chamber. And the fact that we've seen benchmark rates being hiked, 25 basis points as we've seen in Nigeria, would also exacerbate the strain on businesses and on households if we have that. Probably we see a cut maybe in South Africa and a stay in the rates in Ghana. But then if we look up put more emphasis on that, it would affect businesses, and that would not see economic growth for these three countries. And in as much as possible as we might be talking about reducing expenditure, it doesn't even seem as though these governments will be willing to reduce the expenditure or cut or prune down their budgets, so to speak. So how are we going to achieve more when the attendant effects will, in terms of the effects, the negative effects will be more on the people than on government per se?
So that's the reason why there's always a fear that even when an economy decides to embark on fiscal consolidation, there's a potential for some slippages. And those are some of the examples you just mentioned. Because if you look at the Nigerian economy today, yes, quarter three, quarter two data shows some optimism in terms of economic growth rate. But we still need to embark on some expansionary spending in key areas such as infrastructure development to put us in a position to actually do well as a nation, if you look at it from a Nigerian perspective. But that said, I think one of the things that the tax reforms was trying to do was to make the tax system more broad-based, so that it's not just the very few companies and individuals that are paying taxes, but more and more people and businesses that need to pay taxes, that weren't paying taxes, also pay their fair share. That is by and large what they are trying to achieve. However, there are some areas that are facing significant pushback. And I hope that when there's been more consultation with stakeholders, with the public, they can actually finalize this bill and pass it, because there are aspects of the bill that actually make sense and will be very helpful. As I said, Nigeria's case is not as dire compared to that of Ghana. So they can be a little bit, they have the wiggle room to have some slippages. But when you look at Ghana's case, Ghana is part of an IMF program, and there are conditionalities that they need to meet, and those conditionalities are predicated on fiscal consolidation. So the incoming government in Ghana is going to have a pretty tough time, and their case is a bit more serious because you have conditionalities with IMF, and IMF is going to ensure that at least you implement some of those fiscal consolidation measures as much as possible, even though in the short term it can be contractionary and can adversely impact the economy in terms of economic growth rate. But in Ghana's case, it's a necessary evil. It's something they need to do so that they become less debt distressed, and have wiggle room to then embark on more expansionary policies going forward.
Okay, so we're talking about fiscal consolidation here. Is there something that the apex banks of this Sub-Saharan Africa, is there a role they can play in this context? I mean, we've talked about monetary policy easing, we've talked about inflationary rates, maybe cuts in a way or two, but then how do you think they can pivot the possibility of fiscally consolidating the strengths of this region?
So yeah, there's a key role for the central banks to play. If you take Ghana's case, because inflation has been on a downward trend, the central bank can actually start reducing interest rates so that businesses are not hurt in terms of their borrowings in order to invest and expand their businesses, whilst they continue to have the fiscal consolidation measures in place. Because you don't want a situation whereby, due to those measures, taxes are going up, which will hurt businesses. Expenditures on capital projects slow down, which also would adversely hurt businesses. And you also have the central banks increasing interest rates to fight inflation. In that case, you have a situation where the economy really hurts in all fronts. But in the case of Nigeria, when you look at where we are in terms of inflation still has an upward trajectory. So the central bank, CBN, doesn't have a choice but to continue to increase the monetary policy rate, which hurts businesses. And that means that the possibility that they can actually adhere to their fiscal consolidation measures is going to be very difficult, because they need to cut the business sector some break. So they will need to be mindful of how they increase taxes and how they manage their expenditures, especially when it comes to capital projects. So the situation is a bit different when you look at Nigeria versus Ghana. But ultimately, some fiscal consolidation measures are important, and the central banks of those two nations have a role to play to ensure that they manage the potential adverse effects of the short-term impact of fiscal consolidation in both countries.
Okay, well, that's quite noted, I must say. Dr. Josh Bamfo, Partner Head, Transfer Pricing Services, Andersen in Nigeria. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the show.
Thank you for having me.